Everybody thinks about the launch as like the external part of the launch and like the splashy, where are we launching to customers? Are we getting press? Are we doing a product hunt launch? What collateral did we create? But the important thing is really, how do you introduce that product to the teams that are going to be talking to customers about it day in, day out for the next 6 to 12 months, which is like sales, success, your marketing team, and getting the assets and collateral into their hands that they need in order to be able to sell it. So much of the launch process centers around enablement for internal teams.
Product launches are one of those weird responsibilities that can fall between the cracks of your go-to-market teams. There are so many stakeholders to loop in across product, marketing, sales, and customer success, and so many assets to create that it's easy for things to get messy. Derek Osgood has made a career out of leading product launches at PlayStation, Rippling, and now his own company, Ignition. He's our guest on today's show. Welcome to Grow and Tell, the show where revenue leaders tell the growth stories behind today's successful companies. I'm your host, Alex Krakoff.
Grow and tell, grow and tell.
Derek Osgood is a career product marketer turned founder. In 2021, he founded Ignition, a go-to-market platform that helps companies research, build, and launch products. In today's show, we talk about how his gaming experience lends itself to SaaS, how Rippling thought about reinventing a product category, and what it's been like to transition to the role of a founder at his own company. We also go deep into product launch best practices, like who should lead a launch, and all the steps involved in launching a product. If you enjoyed the conversation, please do us a favor and hit like and subscribe on YouTube, or leave us a rating wherever you listen to your podcasts. We really appreciate it, and I hope you enjoyed today's show. Thanks. So I'd love to start today's conversation talking about your time working at PlayStation. What were you focused on when you worked there?
Yeah, I mean, PlayStation was fun. It was my role there was an interesting one because the way that PlayStation structures product marketing, product management actually mirrors like what brand management looks like in CPG companies, in the sense that I actually like had full kind of end-to-end P&L responsibility. It was responsible for kind of like both product planning and like kind of longer range franchise planning for the games that I worked on, as well as the actual full end-to-end marketing campaign structure. So, all the way through launch and post-launch, I was doing kind of sales strategy for, enabling our channel sales motion. I was doing integrated campaign planning for the actual launch itself and managing all of our agency relationships and media buying. So it was like a big chunky role doing a whole bunch of stuff, basically overseeing specific products. And so I was working on like God of War, Gran Turismo, a bunch of like fun games while I was there.
And so how does that work? Because you're not actually making the games, right? So you're maybe not a product manager in that traditional sense, but then you're talking to the game makers, and then at some point they sort of hand off the process to you to commercialize it. Like, how early in that process did you sort of get involved?
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, it's definitely not quite the same as like product management in tech companies where you're actually like working directly with engineering on, like writing out user stories and actually building the product itself. But it was like we were involved at the earliest stages. So it's kind of like a funky publisher studio relationship where we were actually like at the very earliest stages of a game gets even concepted, and we would be involved in the green light process, basically doing like market sizing, trying to identify like, okay, how much demand like is there potentially for this concept, doing a lot of like early focus groups to identify, like what that product should look like, like for example, when launching, kind of I actually didn't work on the more recent God of War franchises, but like a lot of the research done to inform like, oh, that should be set in, Viking days instead of set in ancient Greece. Like that happened in some of the research that we were doing for God of War Ascension, which I worked on. So, it's like you're looking years and years out and doing, what I would categorize as like much more true product management, where you're actually doing like really business planning for the product you're building.
Super interesting. I'd love to kind of go behind the scenes of one of these launches. I don't know if God of War is a good example or if there's another one, but so you do all this research, you're working with the developers. At some point, there's a game that's getting close to being finished. Like, what happens next? How does that kind of commercialization process start, and what does that even look like?
Yeah, I mean, gaming's interesting again because like it's so launch heavy as a culture, right? It's, like 90% of your sales happen in the first 60 to 90 days of the game launching. And so basically like getting the launch right is almost life and death for the product. And so much of the marketing and all the promotion that you're doing is happening before the game actually ever even releases. And it's all about just building demand up front so that when it does release, it becomes a kind of cultural moment, which can then, have some legs of its own to run with instead of you just having to go like acquire new buyers for every single copy of the game. The commercialization process is really chunky. Upfront, you're doing a ton of like financial analysis and long range planning on, kind of what the overall positioning, pricing strategy, what product you need to build. So like, all of the commercial planning around what like add-ons are you selling alongside the core game and how are you structuring pricing packages for that? What like early offers are you giving to, beta users that are going to incentivize them to use the beta because you need to get product feedback before the thing's actually ready for prime time? How are you structuring the beta as a promotional vehicle for the larger game? There's just all of this chunky work that happens before you even get to the stage of like the campaign itself. And then you basically have, a launch campaign where it kind of breaks out into a couple of different phases where you kind of have the initial announce of the game and like, revealing that it's going to even exist at some point to the world, followed by, like some kind of lighter weight nurturing to make sure that people don't forget about you between that announcement to, when you actually start the meat of the campaign, which is really like the short window kind of leading into launch. You're really doing like big TV advertising, events. There's tons of digital advertising as well. I mean, this was like back in the days when Facebook and Google advertising were just starting to emerge and they didn't really exist yet. So we were really like TV events heavy and a lot of like PR and comms work. That's kind of shifted, I think, in recent years to be a little bit more of a mix. But it's a big meaty process. I could spend 2 hours going through like the giant 10,000 step checklist that we had to get all the packaging done, get all the packaging in the hands of all the partners that needed it in order to get it live in retail storefronts, in order to enable support. It's just thinking about every single little piece of the business and businesses around the business and how that launch is going to impact them and making sure they're all like enabled to actually talk about the product effectively.
Super interesting. And yeah, as you're talking, it makes sense. It's just a lot of like brand advertising, essentially, like big mass market, get this game in front of a lot of people. But then there's all those weird little distribution partnerships. Like I assume GameStop was one that you have to figure out what is our strategy with them and how do you actually sell through those channels. Yeah, very interesting, very different than what we're up to now in SaaS.
Yeah, I think it's the truest form of marketing in the sense that like you are really thinking about this thing as like an integrated campaign and a system all the way from like the very top level awareness activity that you're doing down through, how are you actually converting those people at the digital level? How are you then getting them like to engage with and evangelize the product, which involves a lot of like, stuff that looks like pre-tech, growth loops and building out like in-product virality and building out community engagement activities around the product. And so a lot of the tactics actually, like, it's funny, like I've gone through interviews in the past and people are like, oh, I don't really want to hear about your gaming experience because we're hiring for a SaaS marketing role. And I'm like, yeah, but like the gaming experience that I have is probably more applicable to this than a lot of SaaS experience out there.
Yeah, no, it makes you a well-rounded marketer. I mean, I think I used to do a lot of these big integrated campaigns for Google when I was a consultant for them. And it gave me a lens of how do you structure a campaign with the air cover. And I always think of it like war is my example. It's like you want to have the air cover, then you want to have the troops on the ground, like fighting. And you need to think through, okay, what are the different channels? How do you reach people? Because if you just invest into one little channel, you might get some, fruit from that. But like it really works better when you're hitting people from all these different angles. And I think that applies like no matter the product you're trying to market.
And also crafting journeys that actually extend all the way through those angles. Like when we were building TV spots, we would have to target Google advertising around the language that we assumed and had researched that customers would be searching for coming out of that TV spot, rather than just like think about search for our product holistically. It was like, okay, there's going to be some other things that people are going to search for adjacently that come out from our TV creative. And we need to think about how we convert those people through a funnel.
Yeah. And it must have been really fun having just a giant budget too. I think that's one of the fun things about these big companies. And like, I guess kind of tangential to that, like what's it like owning a P&L? What does that actually mean in practice and sort of the marketing sense? Is it essentially just like, here's my marketing dollars, I got to bring in X amount on the other side and kind of have a giant model? Is it that sort of simple, or what does that mean in practice?
I think one of the things that is an interesting dynamic in like today's marketing orgs, especially in tech, is, oftentimes like marketing budgets are really broken out by, functional areas. So you actually have like growth, which is kind of managing the digital buying budget. And then you have like a brand team that's managing the awareness advertising budget. And the problem is that, like, as we were just talking about, like those things don't really work as a system. So me as a P&L owner, I actually wasn't like really doing nearly as much really granular tactical decision making around how budgets were getting allocated. I was really chunking out kind of strategic budgets for specific areas. So I was like, look, the brand budget's going to be this, the digital budget's going to be this, the events budget's going to be this, and then I would do some kind of like big rock planning on what are the main things that need to like work together and interoperate within those budgets. But it was about like kind of systems design around how marketing budgets were getting allocated. And then on top of that, it's just a lot of like, I think the biggest thing is like when you're owning P&L, it's like there's just a lot more financial forecasting that you're doing. You're working with finance a lot more closely to understand like, okay, how many units are we going to sell? What should the actual total budget look like relative to our growth goals? And then, making on the fly adjustments to that based on how what signal you're able to correct or collect leading into it. So, we'd be constantly adjusting like we start with a big giant budget and then, we gradually shrink it down depending on how pre-sales were going, or we'd expand it if it seemed like that thing, had legs to really take off heading into launch.
Super interesting. I know we could talk about this all day, but I want to switch gears and talk about SaaS marketing and talk about first with your story with Rippling, because you joined Rippling, I think right around the Series A at a really important time for the company. And I'm a Rippling user. I'm a big fan of Parker. So I'm very curious kind of what it was like to work there. And maybe my first question is just like, how did you think about approaching product marketing for Rippling? Because I think what's tricky with Rippling is it is this compound startup. There's a lot of different products. There's a lot of pieces to it. So how did you sort of think about that in the early days?
Yeah, I've had a bad habit as a product marketer of picking really hard to product market products as all of my roles that I go into, because I like the challenge. And I think in reality, like Rippling is probably one of the hardest products out there to actually do product marketing for, partly because of bandwidth, partly because of the positioning challenges that come with compound startups. And, it's funny, I came out of Rippling and I was like, oh my God, I'm so burnt out from trying to like wrangle all of this stuff in my head and building this compound startup, and then went out and started one. It kind of has all the same characteristics. And so I think, the ways that I went into it, thinking about it, were, one, I think when you're building a compound startup like that and you have multiple different sub products that are all like, you can't tell each of those stories all in one big package. You really need like a unifying narrative that is at the platform level. So you actually really need to like chunk out the way that you think about the product as a series of sub products and treat it as a true portfolio, where product marketing any individual component is actually really easy. You know how to position the payroll product relative to other payroll products, but you need to think about like how that payroll product interacts with all the other products in your portfolio, and then come up with, what like now, I think has been kind of branded around Rippling Unity, which is, this underlying concept of, hey, all of these things are better because they are tied into the employee record, and because that employee record has all the characteristics that end up driving all the automation that those other tools use. And then you got to bring that to life with a bunch of different like specific examples and case studies in order to make people actually believe the claims that you're making. Because a lot of times the biggest risk when you're marketing a big platform, beyond people just not understanding what it does, is they have been burned so many times by, kind of the jack of all trades, master of none products that don't actually deliver value effectively. And they give you kind of a B- version of all of those different products. So you really need, the only way to overcome that is through like heavy social proof and being able to like really tie it to very, very specific workflows where you can surface like exact recipes for how, that product is gonna work. So it was a lot of like toggling up and down between altitudes. Like I think, a lot of product marketers in more, kind of straightforward companies, they get locked into like the altitude of product that they're working at. And, they're like, okay, I own this like feature set, or I own this like individual product. And they're not really great at like toggling up to the platform level messaging and then back down to the product level messaging. You really need to build that muscle in your head in order to be able to effectively communicate these things.
And what does this work actually look like? Are you creating a bunch of positioning docs and running it by Parker and other people on the team to be like, hey, how does this work for our platform positioning? And then for each of the different product positioning. And then once you do that, do you just create a bunch of decks and websites and assets based off of that? Like, what does that work kind of look like on a more day-to-day or granular level while you're there?
Yeah. So I think that, like Rippling has a pretty unique, like heavily execution driven culture. And so, I think like we were just shipping stuff in a lot of cases and there wasn't as much like review process involved. But, the way that I like to think about this is like you start from the very top. You need to kind of like trickle down in levels of granularity. So, the first thing that I did when I came in there was go through a full positioning exercise around the platform. Try and surface like what are the things that are true about this thing that are not true about any of the other adjacent products in the categories that we play in, and try to like actually define, in this case, like the rules of the category that we play in as well. So I tried to kind of like put us into a box that was somewhat inclusive of some of the other competitors like Gusto and Zenefits, but was also ownable enough that it could be specific to Rippling, and only Rippling could really tick all of the boxes for the category that we were talking about playing in. Did that positioning work at the platform level, ran a bunch of docs through Parker and Matt and some of the other folks at the company. And there were a lot of like workshops leading into that to get at those like little kernels of truth. And then once we had that like top level messaging, it's really about pulling that down quickly into the different sub-product messages and like communicating what that product does. Like first and foremost, like very clearly, what is that product? And through the lens of its existing category. And I tried to not like say, hey, we're like not a payroll tool, we're something else. It was like the payroll product is a payroll product, but it's a payroll product that's better because it connects into this platform level message. And so using that platform story as the differentiator was really like the way that we ended up kind of winning in our group of storytelling.
When I think about positioning, I always think of this framework as you can either reinvent a category or try and create a new category. I'm curious, like Rippling is a little bit of both. Is that right? Or is that the right read on it? And I'm curious how you think about kind of that framework and which type of those sort of choices do you prefer?
We kind of split the difference a little bit. I mean, like Rippling is a little bit of both where, like the nice thing about what Rippling does is that like it's kind of mashing together a couple of categories that are pretty well defined and easy for people to like shorthand and wrap their head around. So you can be like, yeah, we're HR software. And like HR software contains this big bucket of stuff underneath that includes payroll and benefits and everything else. And so we kind of leaned into that as like the existing category, like baseline that we would frame around a little bit. But our whole goal was always to like do some category creation, because the only way that you could actually break people out of a direct like one-to-one feature comparison with other HR tools was to tell this like bigger category story about being this workforce management platform. And so I don't have a bias to like one or the other. I think that for 90% of companies, like they should not go create a category. It comes with a lot of pain. It's an expensive process. It requires a lot of customer education, a lot of brand building over time. And frankly, like most companies don't have the chops in-house to do the narrative design to be able to like actually tell a story that's compelling around creating a category. So most companies should just lean into their existing category and be really clear about like, we are in this category. That gives customers a really clear frame of reference for what their product does at the baseline, but then, explain very clearly like what separates them from that category and like how they differentiate it. When you're talking about like growing categories that exist already, that's another strategy you can take. It's hard. That's equally hard to do, but it's much more prevalent in like CPG, where you're kind of taking a lot of the playbook from category creation, but trying to just expand the pie overall for everybody within your space. I think you're seeing that with a lot of the AI companies right now. Like their strategy should all be not like create a category. It shouldn't be, plug into an existing category. It should be like grow the category for their specific subset of AI infra, for example.
Yep. Makes a ton of sense. So now you're the CEO and co-founder of Ignition. Can you talk about kind of the origin story behind Ignition and how you end up starting the company?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, so Ignition, we basically started because, as a product marketer and product manager kind of throughout my career, I've just been consistently disappointed with the lack of tools available for those roles. I think there are a couple of roles that basically span a really significant amount of surface area of like disciplines and market and data. And I found it really hard when launching products to drive alignment, within those companies because of the fact, not that it's like tough to kind of jump around all these tools, but like basically companies as a whole lacked shared context on who their customers were, what their customers cared about, how to talk about the products that they built. And you try and kind of slap band-aids on this in the form of like project management tools, so everybody kind of has visibility into what's happening through the launch process, sales enablement tools, so that everybody kind of has access to all that collateral that's been created. And then, you obviously have a bunch of docs and spreadsheets floating around that contain a lot of like core positioning messaging data. But the problem is like none of those things actually unify the company around the core customer data that drives all the decision making. So basically we set out to build this platform that gives everybody transparency and visibility into the launch process so that the whole company could kind of rally around commercializing a product and making it successful. But we wanted to drive that from the bottom up with like all similar to Rippling and what we do with employee data. We want to drive that with customer data, where we're actually plugging into all the different sources of data that exist in your company and externally to your company, creating a cohesive view of like who your customers are, who your competitors are, how you market against them, and then turning that into a much more actionable launch motion where you can actually use that stuff to, identify product ideas, to identify, build go-to-market plans, and create all the collateral to feed those go-to-market plans so that it's all based off that same central view of like the combo of your customer data and your data about your product.
It's a problem and product solution that very much resonates with me. I mean, at Lattice, product launches were always such an interesting stitched together process of using like Asana and Notion and all these different tools and Slack and all of our different meetings. And it was like herding cats. And then no one had the context. No one knew where to look. And I think the only way we ever got it done was just meetings and like face to face, and which was not that efficient at all. And it was just, very messy. So very excited for what you guys are building. Yeah.
Sheer force of will. It's like all the information lives in one PMM's head, and it's just up to that person to just like blast it in 10,000 different ways across the organization. And it never lands because it's so fragmented.
Totally. And it worked like, to your point, like it worked when it was all in my head. It worked when I could like, when we were small enough, when it was in my head and I could just flip my chair around and talk to the PM and talk to the designer and be like, all right, we're launching it. Is it good to go? But then as soon as we like had a traditional product marketing team and then we had like a product manager team and just all these different people, it became so messy so fast. So no, totally love what you guys are building. I'm curious, like what is the journey to product market fit been like for you? Because you mentioned it's kind of a compound startup. There's a ton of different things to build. That's an interesting puzzle. I'm going through this myself at Doc. So curious, like how do you think about that like elusive search to find product market fit?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because there's been a bunch of like, obviously like market changes that have happened over the course of the company's life. Like the early version of the product that we were building was like pre-AI existing. So a lot of like the workflows and automation that we were building in the product was all kind of workflow based. And now it's been unlocked by actually being able to use AI to power a lot of this in ways that we had originally knew that we were going to build, but we've been able to build much, much faster. So I think the journey to product market fit has been funky because our product has to cover so much surface area, right? Like product marketers do so many things. You have documentation, you have all the like, what is the status of things? You have all the asset management, you have all the research tools to actually go collect all of this data. And then, obviously stitching all that stuff together and making it actually work in concert as a system. It's a really challenging product problem to build around. And so we, for the first year of the company, we're basically building, and all we were doing was kind of building the house for this information. So we were building all the project management tools, all the documentation tools. And that was, we very clearly did not have product market fit through that, but we knew that we had to build that in order to actually just cover the table stakes. And customers were demanding, because their existing frame of reference around launches was like project management, they were just demanding project management tools out of us. And we didn't want to build those, but we did anyway to kind of appease those early users. And it kind of derailed us for a bit. And we ended up like kind of moving off of our path to like building the really differentiated stuff, which is like, how do you use the research tools to get the data into the platform that feeds all this other actions? And so then we spent like the next year kind of like working with customers to refine the research tools, get some of the like workflow built out. And at that point, we built so much surface area of product that a lot of the like actual usability of it had gotten really messy, and it just had become really complex and difficult to use. So it really wasn't until we actually were able to take those two parts, marry them together, and then do some cleanup to make sure that the system actually works, like cleanly in concert, that we really felt like we hit, what would, be close to product market fit. And I think, this product market fit, I think, is like a journey that companies are always on, and you never like really have it. And if you do have it, you have it for a very specific point in time, and it evolves. So I would say we're close, but I never want to say like, oh yeah, we have clear product market fit. But it's been just a journey of like iteration and a lot of like trying things, failing. We added like new products, and we're like, okay, like if this one takes off, like we'll lean into that one, we'll double down on it. It'll just kind of create the wedge, and we'll kind of like focus on that for a bit and then come back around to these other parts and stitch it all back together. But what we've kind of realized is that like, again, the system on the whole is the problem. And so, we actually had to build like all of this surface area in order to be able to actually nail it.
Yeah. I feel like product market fit is rarely like what you read about on Twitter or X, whatever it's called, where it's like, all right, one day you just wake up, you have it, and you have, millions and millions of dollars coming into your bank account. I think it's exactly what you said. It's just this like constant journey of iterating, and you might have product market fit in one segment, but you don't have it in another, and you're just constantly pushing. And so, yeah, it's such an interesting puzzle. I'm curious, like you have this marketing background like I do. Like, what has it been like building products yourself? Like, do you think of yourself as like the product manager for the product, or do you have, I assume you have a technical co-founder too? Like, how do you sort of think about actually like running a product team? Because that's been one of my biggest learnings at Doc. I'm curious how you've been dealing with it.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, that's been a learning experience for me. I do have a technical co-founder, and he's been a PM himself. And so, it's nice that we have some kind of like quality product chops in-house. I do view myself as kind of like the product manager for the product, because realistically, like a lot of it is productizing my own process. And so I'm really heavily involved in product. Early on, I did some early like mock-ups and like early designs myself, which like they were terrible. And like I think I probably set the company back 6 months by trying to design some of it myself for the early days. But it's the biggest learning for me has been, I had done a lot of product work in the past. Like at Rippling, I built our whole like app store, basically like me and a designer and an engineer. And like at, previous companies, I've done a ton of work around onboarding and like, being heavily involved in like product experience from a product marketing perspective. But they were much more tightly scoped projects where, it's like, you're not really designing the whole system, right? And so I think I've seen you like do a LinkedIn post or two about this, where, you realize just how granularly you really need to get into those designs in order for them to like actually work when you start thinking about like real user flows and setting screens and how all of that stuff interacts together. And it's just a level of like depth that is really hard to wrap your head around at first as a marketer jumping into it. And so it's more like a culture shock than anything. Like I feel like I've got my head around it now, but the early days was a lot of missteps, partly because of my inexperience working at that level of granularity of product.
Totally. And like, I'm okay at Figma. And like, I think what's so interesting is like, I guess that when you're building, like we're used to building websites. And so it's much more easier, like, hey, build the layout like this, make this thing. But when it's product, like, okay, I would make like a Figma design. My co-founder is a much better designer than me, but I would make a shitty Figma design. And then the engineering co-founder would be like, but wait, what does this button do? What does that thing do? What about this edge case? And then you end up building like 50 screens for like a really simple thing that you thought. And so I don't know, that's been a really big learning experience. And I think now we finally, like, I know that all those questions are going to come up, so we try and get ahead of it, but it still blows my mind just how granular you have to be. And then our other big learning recently has been like, just because it looks good in the designs, and even if we do all of those flows, it doesn't mean it's actually going to feel good in code. Like as soon as you get it into the code, it might feel different. And so you need to kind of give yourself permission to change it once it's in code too. And I think now I feel much better about our process once I've kind of had those two realizations.
That's the biggest trap. I mean, it's like it can look perfect and it can make total sense in design, and then you get it in code and it doesn't really feel great at all. And like sometimes it's to the point where it's unusable, and you don't really know until it's live. I also think like as marketers, like we're so used to giving feedback, right? Like like a lot of what we do is like shape creative work, and so we're not the ones who are like actually creating it in many cases. There's like a lot of cases where you are, but end of the day, like a lot of the creative direction that I've done, I consider myself to be very good at like giving quality feedback to shape something from the outside. But once you step into the weeds and you're actually like doing the design work yourself, it's hard to like level yourself back out to the altitude to be able to actually assess it as a user objectively and identify those weak points. And like I notice myself when I'm like on the workflows where I'm really heavily involved in the design and the speccing of it, it ends up worse because I'm not actually able to like level myself out as much as like if I'm working with my designer and he's kind of driving it and I'm giving kind of feedback externally.
Oh, totally. The perspective is so hard because it's so intuitive for you because you built it. So you know where the button is, you know where the things should go. And then you show it to someone else who's never seen it. They're like, wait, this doesn't make any sense. And so it's so interesting. That's honestly one of the best parts of like growing the team at Doc is we can like pull on other people at the company to be like, hey, does this make sense to you? Because it made sense in my brain, but might not make sense in every brain. Yeah. Such a building product is, it's been definitely the hardest thing about Doc, but the most rewarding. I'm really enjoying learning like the kind of that new skill set. Yeah. How have you approached like growing Ignition? Like, I know it's still early days for you guys, but in terms of the marketing and investment, like, are you doing founder-led sales? Are you, doing a lot of podcasts like this? Like, how have you sort of thought about kind of getting that initial group of users? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so our earliest users were just me on LinkedIn, like pinging people directly, doing founder-led sales, and like I explicitly focused on people that I didn't know. I really didn't want people who were like friends giving me early feedback, and like I think there's like pros and cons to that. Obviously, like it was tougher to get early feedback from those people because they're just less engaged, but it also, in my opinion, like was truer validation for the product that we were building. So, a lot of it was early LinkedIn, just pinging early days. And then since then, we've really focused on like two main areas. One is like building out SEO motions for ourselves and, like using, because of the scope of the product that we have, like breaking it into free tools that we can offer up as lead magnets and get people into the product and like use as SEO magnets as well. And then a lot of outbound email. And like, so we've been running, a lot of the playbook that we had at Rippling, which is, cold email at like really significant scale. And like we aren't doing nearly the scale that we were doing when we were growing Rippling, but we've automated, a lot of cold email and spent a lot of time message and persona testing that and just getting it to like a really tightly operationalized state. I was selling for the longest time. I just recently brought on our first like kind of true AE, and it's been like game changing. I think, I realize I can kind of sell things, but like realistically, I'm not. I'm not a salesperson, and I shouldn't be doing that nearly as much as I was. So, we've kind of grown the team a little bit recently. We've added our first SDR, we've added our first marketer, we've added our first, sales like AE, and but otherwise, it was like kind of me, myself, and I just doing a lot of LinkedIn posting and LinkedIn DMing and cold email up until now.
Yeah, that first sales hire is a life changer. I think I had a similar thing where it's like, I'm okay at sales. I can get out a call, do the demo, say the spiel, but I'm way too feature selling. I'm like, look at all the cool stuff I built. Look at this thing. Tell me. And I'm just trying to get feedback about like the features I built as opposed to like understanding their problems and the solution and really building champions and all that stuff. And as we built the team at Doc, it's like, oh yeah, I suck at sales. I'm way better as a marketer growth person. Yeah.
Yeah, so you just feature dump, and like that's fine when your product's really small, but like I think both of us are building like relatively chunky products with like a lot of different workflows in them, and it's hard to feature dump and be able to actually get somebody's head around the product if you do that.
I'd love to spend kind of the rest of our time just talking about product marketing and product launches a little bit more broadly, because you're a wealth of knowledge here and you're obviously thinking about this stuff all day long. I think my first question is maybe a basic one, like, Who should lead a product launch?
I mean, I generally believe that it should be a product marketer. It does depend on the characteristics of that product marketer. Like product marketers take a lot of different shapes and sizes. Some of them are not really great at leading launches because they're either not, strategic or not operationalized enough, and they may just be more kind of like content and sales enablement skewing product marketers. So it depends on the skill set. If not product marketing, then I generally think that actually the product manager should, because they're just going to be the closest to the product itself and like be able to align timeframes and have the most holistic view of like who the customer is, why they care about it. But it does kind of depend on the character, like the structure of the marketing org. So if product marketing is like well built out, I would say product marketing should. If they're not, then typically it should be somebody in product.
And then what does kind of like the perfect product launch process look like? Like, and I'm sure it's different for every company and all that stuff, but are there like typical phases that people can follow, or somebody who's never really launched a product before? Like, what advice would you say for them as sort of building a roadmap towards that launch?
I'll try and give a concise answer on this. Like realistically, I could spend 4 days and probably not get you through the whole process because it's a big chunky one. But, I think like, typically, you kind of think about product launches as like you have an alpha, you have a beta, and you have a GA phase, right? So like most people kind of think about launches through the lens of the actual product delivery cycle. So upfront, like before alpha, you should be doing a bunch of research. You should before the product's ever even built, product marketing should be tightly embedded with product, actually doing a lot of the like generative customer discovery to understand like who customers are, why they need this thing, what the problems that are being solved for them are, and informing the roadmap off of that. You should also be doing competitive intel at that period where you're understanding like, okay, what are the possible alternatives that customers could be using for this thing that you're launching? And what are they good and bad at? Where are we going to actually separate ourselves, and where should we be focusing efforts from a messaging perspective? Moving through the alpha period, like alpha is typically when you would just start onboarding like some of your friendlies. Like you onboard like a couple of like really trusted customers. Usually it's more like dog fooding internally or working with like partners or, investors to kind of gauge the whether the product is kind of solving the problems that you set out to solve. During that period, you're really doing a lot of like core strategic development, like positioning, understanding positioning, messaging, what your channel plan is going to look like and how you're actually going to roll out and communicate that product to people. What assets do you need to get created in order to launch it? During betas, when you're like doing a lot more of the executional work, it's when you're actually like creating all of that collateral and even starting to do some of the like external pre-promotion and starting to kind of like set up teasers or exclusivity programs or beta or like closed betas with a slightly broader group of customers that may have opted into a beta program. And then at GA, when you actually launch it and make it publicly available, you obviously have launch day, which is your big splashy launch. But a couple of weeks before that, you're doing a lot of internal training, and like so much of the launch process centers around enablement for internal teams. Like everybody thinks about like the launch as like the external part of the launch and like the splashy, where are we launching to customers? Are we getting press? Are we doing a product hunt launch? Like what collateral did we create? But the important thing is really, how did you introduce that product to the teams that are going to be talking to customers about it day in, day out for the next 6 to 12 months, which is like sales, success, your marketing team, and getting the assets and collateral into their hands that they need in order to be able to sell it. So, you do a lot of training leading into launch day, then you do a big splashy day to kind of just like put a lightning strike in the ground and make sure that like the world pays attention to it. And then you should have kind of an ongoing rolling thunder approach after that, where you're taking a lot of the messaging that you used for that launch and like ideally continuing to trickle out other content and collateral to keep momentum on that launch for, 1, 2, 3 months after launch. I think I just did a podcast earlier today with Tamara from Kajabi, and she was saying that, basically like we were tearing down Equals' recent like AI assistant launch. And one of the creative things they did is they, did a blog post after launch talking about how they named the product that they had launched. And it's like taking things that are decisions that you made during your launch process to extend the launch process by creating other downstream collateral is a really like just easy, low-hanging fruit creative way for you to actually be able to like to carry that momentum beyond, the day of launch itself. And that's the biggest thing is like when you're thinking about launch, the one biggest piece of advice I would give is like, think about it as a commercialization process. Like, don't think about it as a process leading up to launch day. You're doing a bunch of work leading into launch day, but you're also doing all that work to support a big post-launch, selling process.
And how do you know if a launch is successful? Do you just look at revenue tied back to that? Is it user engagement? Do you recommend people set up goals ahead of time? This is something I always struggled with and we never really got right at Lattice. So I'm curious what you think.
Yeah, so you should definitely like have goals leading into the launch and like set up a true kind of OKR structure for that launch. And again, like we're talking more about like kind of bigger product launches. There's also obviously like smaller releases that are not going to have quite as much upfront planning. But I think usually like the way that launches should be contributing to revenue. Like you're not building things at your company just for fun and for giggles. It's like you are doing this stuff because it is somehow, some way going to meaningfully contribute to the company's bottom line, whether that's retaining more customers, opening a new market and like having a new TAM to be able to go after, or creating more upsell opportunities with your existing customers. And so you should be mapping to those business metrics. And the way that I like to set goals for launches is I like to set like a business metric, which is usually some kind of revenue target. Could be something like an upsell or cross-sell target if you're not talking about like top line revenue. And then you set a marketing target, which is basically the objective at the strategic level of like, okay, we want to grow this category by this percent, or we want to penetrate this new category that we're entering by this percent. And so you try and actually get to just kind of an objective level target for, what the approach to marketing you're going to take is. And then you have like a communications goal, which is how much did we influence customers' perception of the product into, whatever message you're trying to get across is. And you can set up measurement for each of those different things, right? Like, when you're talking about revenue targets, that's pretty easy. You're looking at like overall revenue impact. How did that, move up or down pre and post launch on average? And like, ideally you're looking at like a revenue growth rate. At the marketing target level, like depending on what your goal is, like category penetration, you're looking at, okay, of 10,000 customers in this category, we now have 1,000 of those. So we penetrated the market 10%. And when it comes to the communication goal, you're really doing that through like qualitative surveying and like understanding how customers regurgitate back to you the message that you tried to communicate in that launch. So there's a bunch of different ways to do it. I mean, there's like, that's a rudimentary structure for this. You can go a lot deeper into any one of those areas, but generally, like I would always try and tie it back to revenue, because like otherwise, why are you investing the effort in launching the thing in the first place?
Yeah, no, I think it's a really, really helpful framework. And you obviously talk to a lot of companies about launches. You see this a lot. Is there a trend that you see where the launch process always breaks down? Is there something where, there's always kind of that problem area in a launch?
I mean, you can take your pick. I think every single company that I talk to, barring a very, very small set of like exceptions, their launch process is in some way, shape, or form a mess. Usually it's the biggest reason that it breaks down is because they don't have a process in the first place. They don't actually have a muscle built out, and they don't have a defined set of steps that they're going to take. They don't have a defined way of understanding like which launches are we going to invest effort in. And like, so there's no tiering framework in place to actually be able to identify, okay, this should be a big launch. This should be a medium launch. This should be a small launch. This thing we shouldn't launch at all. And that leads to them actually just kind of scrambling at the last second because they don't actually know what timeframes look like to be able to actually launch the thing. So they end up just basically spending, a week leading into it, and then they just send one email to customers and that's their launch. And customers, 30% of customers open it. Most of them don't actually engage. They forget about it 2 weeks later, and then that product ends up flopping. So it's like, it's very common. But the biggest place that people break down is they either just don't have a process or they don't do research to inform that launch.
Yeah. I think another one I'll add is just communication in general. I feel like when we were doing launches at Lattice, the moments where we messed up, it was like the PM thought it was a super important launch, but marketing didn't. And then that was communicated really poorly, like priorities, or like in the launch process, like one team got left behind. Like we really focused on the sales team and like enabling them, but like we kind of forgot about CS and like new, customers were kind of forgotten about. And like, yeah, like we just kind of forgot about each little stakeholder because it's a lot of work to manage all these different kind of personas on the go-to-market team and across the company.
100%. And they each need different subsets of information. They each need different types of enablement. I mean, go to market, like at the end of the day, is an enablement exercise. It's all about getting the right information into the right team's hands at the right time so they can actually go tell customers about it. And so if you don't communicate effectively, if you don't have a motion for getting those teams visibility and you don't have a motion for getting information and assets in their hands, like the launch fails no matter what, no matter how good your messaging is, no matter how good your marketing is.
I'm curious how you think about kind of the structure of a product marketing team and like the different functions at some scale, and you can kind of take your pick because you say, all right, product marketing is responsible for launches. Like, do you just have one PM who's doing all the launches? Do you segment the team by product area? Like, how do you sort of think about those different structures of a product marketing team?
Well, so I have a slightly spicy take on product marketing as it relates to like marketing team structure on the whole, which is, yeah, I came from PlayStation early on in my career. And like I mentioned, like the beginning of the show, like that looked like a brand management role where I was actually doing a lot of integrated campaign planning. And I truly believe that the best marketing orgs are structured in that way where each product marketer is kind of a product owner for their specific product line or product or whatever it is that, whatever, how you want to subsegment your business. And that product marketer is actually like owns some degree of P&L for that product. And the other marketing teams are actually acting as support teams for that product marketing team to execute go-to-market strategy around, a much longer time horizon for their products. And so I typically recommend that, like a product marketing team is mostly aligned by product vertical. And then if you have, a PLG motion, there's some additional kind of like side product marketing work that tends to be pretty horizontal that sits, kind of alongside that, which is usually you have like potentially a pricing expert, potentially a sales enablement expert, potentially somebody who's focusing on like onboarding in product and cross-sell. And those can be horizontal roles, but they don't actually look like true product marketing in most cases. They're kind of like a subset of it. But the people who are really doing like go-to-market, they're each aligned to a product vertical and each of them owns the go-to-market for their own products.
Really cool. I like that setup a lot. And so then there's like a shared services within the marketing team for demand gen, digital, creative, all those things. And then the PMs they come up with the positioning and the messaging, but then also act as the project managers to get all of that stuff done for the launch or ongoing support or whatever it is.
Yeah, and product marketing basically acts as kind of air traffic control across all of that. And like the marketing budget on the whole ends up getting broken out where, each product vertical has its own budget, but then you do have like some shared services budget that sits across that for the, demand gen and creative teams and whatnot.
One question that I think pretty much every founder who's maybe not a marketer asks themselves is like, what's the profile they should think of when they're hiring their first marketer? I'm sure you've been on calls being asked that yourself. Should it be someone with a product marketing background? Should it be more demand gen? Should it be somewhere in the middle? What's your take on that question?
I do think it very much depends. Like, unfortunately, as with all business questions, it's like, it kind of depends. If you are, for most startups, like especially when they're like technical founders who don't have a marketing background, I would definitely recommend starting with a product marketer, but you have to find the right product marketer. You have to find a product marketer who actually can flex into the growth marketing work, which like a lot of them can't, especially if you're looking at like product marketers from bigger companies. They just haven't had to go and like operate the knobs on Facebook ads or on, like building out SEO programs. And that's a level of tactical expertise that like is tricky to find. But I think that most startups early on, the primary things that they suffer from are product marketing problems. It's like they're either priced wrong, their positioning isn't clear or isn't hammered out. They haven't identified like what the right persona for themselves to target is. And like those are product marketing things. But if you have a very narrow, clear product where like you feel like you have really clear message market fit and like people understand what you do and they're converting at a high rate, like all you got to do is generate leads. And in that case, you should be really hiring like a demand gen person who can just fill the funnel.
So you've been an early employee at a number of companies and worked with tons of early stage companies as well. Like, I'm curious, how has it been different as a founder? Like juxtaposing those sort of two experiences, like what's it been like being a founder for you?
It's funny. I mean, it feels pretty similar. I will say that the biggest thing is like I feel like I'm back at the beginning of my career again, where it's like I went from classic, I forget what's the effect. It starts with a D. I'm blanking on it, but classic case of I thought that I knew everything, then I didn't know anything. Then I thought that I started getting good at things again, and really started to understand my role as head of marketing, head of product at these companies, and then I dropped back into a new role where like I'm suddenly just flailing around in the dark again on like half of the things that I'm doing day to day. So it just kind of feels like a big learning experience again. And then on top of that, it also is just like you're taking all of the complexity that exists of like being an early employee in a department and then amplifying that by all of the departments in the company. And so it's like you take, it's really hard being the first marketer in a company. It's 5 times harder being the first marketer, first salesperson, first product person, first everything else. So it's just like more intense in most cases.
It's a very humbling experience. I think you start questioning yourself, like, wait, do I actually know what I'm talking about? This and that, because there's so much rejection and so much like uncertainty as you're building and doing things. And yeah, and it's funny, like you talk to a family member, they're like, "Ooh, you're the CEO," and it's like, well, CEO really means I'm just doing all this bitch work all the time. Like I'm an early employee on every function. It's such a funny thing, yeah. But existentially, you just have that pressure too of like, am I going to make it? Is this going to work? Like, I feel that way more as the CEO than I did as an early stage employee. Cause I was like, whatever, it doesn't work. His problem. Yeah. I'll go do something else.
Yeah. Like you just go get another job. And like, as a founder, you feel like your entire identity is tied up in the company. And you're just like, if it doesn't work, then my life is over.
Yeah, so true. Maybe a good way to end it would be like, what are you most excited about for Ignition this year? Is there a product you're excited about or just the year ahead? How are you thinking about things?
Well, so 2 things I'm excited about. Well, kind of cheat here. One is like we were talking about measurement for launches. We've got some really cool measurement stuff coming in the end of May that's going to help kind of like truly prove the impact of launches and normalize that across all the other growth metrics in your company. But I think the thing that I'm most excited about that's happening in a much more near-term capacity is in early April, we're going to really have like wrapped up this whole underlying data layer. Like right now, if you think about how Ignition works, there's like a bunch of specific workflows where we help collect data and like do things with it, for example, in competitive intel. But it's all going to feed one giant underlying data lake so that basically everything that you would do as a product marketer can be automated to the degree, like based off of your actual customer feedback. So for example, you're going to have all the customer conversations that are happening across your company. We'll be able to create all the feature ideas for you out of that for your product team. We'll be able to map that to upsell opportunities for the sales team based on your account data, so that when those things ship, we can automatically notify sales and tell them about the thing that they should go sell. And then when the product marketing team is building out their go-to-market plans, we can create all the collateral for those go-to-market plans, not just based on your messaging and some basic like GPT wrapper style inputs, but based on actual customer language that's refined based on your top 10 customers. So that you can basically get like a full end-to-end product roadmap, go-to-market plan, and all the content to feed that campaign built out for you almost instantaneously. Really cool.
Really, really cool. Especially like, I always struggle to close the loop with a customer or a sales process. Like you build a thing because somebody asked you for it, and then you're like, you do that 3 months later, and then you never close that loop. And so that's amazing that you guys like really make that super easy. If people want to check out Ignition, reach out to you, where's the best place to find you?
Yeah, so I mean, Ignition, we're at haveignition.com if you want to go check out the product. But if you want to get in touch with me, I'm all over LinkedIn. It's linkedin.com/Derek Osgood 3, I think. So get in touch.
Awesome. Thank you so much for the time today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Alex. This is a blast.
That's a wrap on another episode of Grow and Tell. If you enjoyed the show, subscribe to us on YouTube or your favorite podcast platform, or find every episode at growandtellshow.com. I'm your host, Alex Krakov. Thank you for listening.